Do you need any fancy graphics?
Shouldn't. It's worth a try. Is there a button at the bottom of the full screen? I guess you can't in Safari.
Let's just do this. We'll just close everything else out. And then I'll turn off notifications, and then we'll be good.
Okay. Or if you want to download the app, then maybe that'll mute your notifications.
Tell you what, why don't I turn off notifications? Well, I'll do the intro.
Thank you so much.
You do.
It's a lifesaver.
Let's see. Google Sheets. I don't want Google Sheets. I want Google Slides. I'm just going to put it in slides and we can get full screen.
Oh, great.
Let's plug it back in.
You are a man after my own heart. I'm only one with 3 Diet Cokes, so you're making me look good.
Google Slides.
Call on internet magic.
I had a very, very British breakfast because I had a Pims in the breakfast. Pims.
Bingo's.
That's the alcoholic beverage which British always have.
So,
We're really close, really close.
so it's up there. We had it. Huh. Oh, great. Well,
What happened? This one just did.
Alex, do you want to play that and maybe Trey can start with the 2 introductions?
Yeah, we're going to have to give, let's try one more time and then we can give up if,
Okay.
assuming Trey is.
Amiable.
All right.
all right. Awesome. Okay.
It's worth the wait.
So you're going to go first. So good afternoon, everybody. I am Trey Grayson. I was formerly the 2-term Secretary of State of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and served as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State during that time. And now I'm an attorney with Frost Brown Todd, which is a big regional law firm. I'm in our Florence, Kentucky office. And I really appreciate everybody coming here today. This is a panel discussion about a very important issue that's brought together some interesting groups that you don't often see as co-sponsors on a particular issue. I want to begin by thanking Verified Voting, the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, Common Cause, Freedom Works, and the National Election Defense Coalition for helping to put this together today. There's no doubt that in the 2016 election cycle, there were many attempts to hack into our election infrastructure. The Senate Intelligence Committee just released a bipartisan unanimous report as the most recent summary of that. So in the past couple of years, what has been going on? What have the states been doing? What have the federal government been doing? Are there some legislative solutions that need to be adopted? So today what we want to, and what can we do between now and November 2018 to make sure that our elections, our democracy are safeguarded? So today we've got a panel of folks who are going to talk about that. At the end of our conversation, which should take place, we're going to wrap up around 3 o'clock, so about an hour and a half. Right near the end, Senator James Lankford, who's from Oklahoma, who's a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee and is the co-sponsor of a bill with his colleague Senator Amy Klobuchar called the Secure Elections Act. He's got a couple of votes this afternoon in the Senate, and the hope is that he will be here to wrap up the conversation. So please don't leave early unless you have to, because you'll miss Senator Lankford, and we really appreciate his leadership. So on the panel today, we've got Alex Halderman, who's a professor at the University of Michigan and a fellow with Verified Voting. And actually what we'll do is I'll just do a quick introduction right before each one of them speaks. So we'll start with Alex. We've divided this kind of into two bits. We're going to talk about the problem. What is the problem, to bring everybody up to speed. We're not going to get too far in the weeds, but we are going to get a little technical. You need to understand a little bit of the technical to understand the problem. And then we're going to be focused on the future. What are solutions? What are some of the solutions that we need as a country, as states, as election administrators? And so we'll conclude with that kind of proactive part of the conversation. But first up, Alex, and we've got our Google Sheets working, and we're going to let him go before my iPad decides to act up again. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much, Trey, for that introduction. And I have to say that projection is widely considered to be the second hardest problem in computer science after printing. So I'm Alex Halderman. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Michigan. I'm also the director of something called the Michigan Center for Computer Security and Society. But I've spent the better part of the last 10 years studying problems in securing electronic voting. And I want to talk to you today about the cybersecurity perspective on our election system. So how do I advance this? So our election system in the United States is uniquely complex in the world. Unlike most countries, we have a highly distributed system that involves people voting in thousands of jurisdictions across the country. In a typical election, we'll have states across the country voting with different forms of election technology. And as you know, states or often individual counties are in charge of selecting the technology that they'll use on election day. But we can divide up the kinds of voting equipment that are used in this country into two categories. There are optical scan machines, which should be pictured here, but for some reason are not. And they're DRE, or direct recording electronic voting machines. The optical scan machines, the voter fills out a paper ballot, that gets scanned and put in a ballot box. The DREs, you use a touch screen or other interface, and the main record of the vote becomes something in a digital memory. Both styles of voting machines are computers, and like every other computer you've ever seen, they can potentially be hacked. The question is, how easy or hard is it? So are these machines secure? Some of you may have seen earlier this year, I came in and did a briefing in this building for members, in which I brought one of these voting machines. This is an AccuVote TSX, a widely used touchscreen voting machine. And I demonstrated that it would be possible to remotely rig this machine to steal votes. And we even held a mock election, and it came out the way the hackers had planned rather than the way the members who voted on the machine voted. But computer scientists like me have been studying U.S. voting machines for years, and we've gotten many different models of machines into the lab. And what we have found is that on a typical machine, it is possible to infect the voting machine with malicious software that could steal votes. Now let me show you how. I'll use as an example this AccuVote TS machine that I demonstrated. So on these machines, some of the vulnerabilities involve the removable memory cards that are used before the election to program the ballot design and after the election to offload the electronic votes. If an attacker can infect that memory card with malicious software, when election officials put the card into the machine before the election, it will infect the machine. The malicious software will stay on the machine and can silently, in the background, rewrite the records of the votes. So the election that I demoed was George Washington versus Benedict Arnold, the traitor of the Revolution. And on my machine, because of the malicious software that I wrote, Benedict Arnold will always win, no matter how many people vote for George. But it's not just this one model of voting machine or this one vulnerability. So here's an example from a study that California conducted about 10 years ago. California did a landmark security review where they had qualified experts carefully go through the source code of every voting machine used in the state. And they produced hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation of many dozens of serious vulnerabilities in every single one of the systems. Unfortunately, the result of research over the last 10 years is that every single kind of American voting machine that's been rigorously studied by security experts has been found to suffer from vulnerabilities that could allow vote stealing attacks. And what's worse, much of the country uses equipment now that's a decade or more out of date. In many cases, they're not receiving security patches. And that machine that I demonstrated, the AccuVote TSX, just one example, has software, is running in many states across the country with software that has had known vulnerabilities for more than a decade. So those are the machines, and they're what keeps me up at night. But how would an attacker translate vulnerabilities in machines into the ability to, say, sabotage a major election? Well, there are a couple of different ways you might go about trying to interfere with elections through election computers. One is you might try to alter election night results by hacking into reporting systems. This, I think, would be detected, however. It could undermine confidence, but I think that states would figure it out through their normal post-election canvassing. Or you could try to sabotage the registration system by breaking into online registration databases or into the e-poll books that are used to check voters in on election day. This could be used to selectively cause long lines in jurisdictions that tend to vote heavily for one party or another. But once again, this would be visible and detectable by design. That's why what I worry about most in looking ahead is attacks that could silently try to alter election results. And the way to do that is by hacking into the voting machines themselves. So how easy would this be? Well, there are three challenges. And I'll go through these very quickly so you can see whether they're surmountable. So surmountable. Well, the first is just the diversity of our system. And often this can be an asset. There's no single point to hack into that will change election results across the country. On the other hand, before a close election, say for the presidency or for control of the Congress, national results might hinge on just a few swing states or swing districts. And each of these places is likely to have its own independent system. An attacker could try scanning them all and looking for the weakest systems, the most weakly protected, and striking there. So in a close election, you go from diversity being a strength to really having a diversity of strength and weakness and giving the attacker multiple opportunities to find places that they're able to subvert. So the second challenge is that the voting machines aren't connected to the internet, and you often hear this from election officials. And thank goodness they're not, because it would be one of the most poorly thought out things I could imagine to take your voting machines and paint a bullseye on them by plugging them in to the global network. However, they're not as far from the internet as they may seem. So before every election, every voting machine in the country, whether you're voting with pieces of paper or on touchscreen computers, has to be programmed with the design of the ballot. And that ballot design is created on some PC workstation, either operated by the county or operated by an outside vendor. It's called an election management system. And those election management systems aren't always so difficult to hack into. If someone hacks into one of these systems, they can spread malicious software to voting machines throughout the jurisdiction, because election officials will copy the ballot design to all those machines on removable memory cards or USB sticks. How hard is it to hack into these systems? I'll show you an example really quickly. In Michigan, about 3/4 of counties outsource this function to just 3 small businesses, and they're not high-tech security firms. They're 10, 12-person companies. Here's the website for one of them. You can see on this website, among other things, they have their whole employee directory with everyone's picture, name, job title, and email address. If I wanted to hack elections in Michigan, I think I'd go to their website, forge an email to Sue there, the administrative assistant, from Larry, the president. And that's easy to do, to forge email. And I tell her to urgently open this attachment. She clicks on it, I infect her computer, now I'm in their systems. I can spread to voting machines in jurisdictions across the Midwest. All right, so unfortunately the machines aren't as far from the internet as we might want. There's just one more challenge though, and that's that now more than 70% of the country records votes on a piece of paper, either one the voter fills out or one that's filled in by a machine for the voter that the voter can see. And paper ends up being a wonderfully robust kind of backup and safeguard against cyber attacks. It may seem retrograde, but it's not. In science and technology, in other kinds of critical systems, all the time we want to have some kind of physical fail-safe. Like if you fly on commercial aviation, you have a fancy GPS navigation system, but also by law, your aircraft has a magnetic compass just in case the computer systems fail. It's just common sense. So with voting, paper provides an excellent defense because we can create a paper record of every vote and an electronic record of every vote, and then compromising both of them in a way that someone could get away with would be very, very difficult. Harder than hacking paper or cheating on paper or hacking the computers. But to get that defense, we need to audit these records to make sure they agree. If you don't look at the paper, it might as well not be there. And there are very efficient techniques that we'll get into in this panel in order to efficiently audit paper. You don't have to look at all of it. You just have to look at a random sample, like taking a poll before an election. There's just one problem, though. Most states today don't look at the paper or don't look at enough of the paper to make a meaningful check of whether the electronic results are right. So it's easier than we thought to hack a close national contest. You look at polls to find the swing states, target the weakest of them. Hack into election management systems in order to spread malicious software to the voting machines, have that software hijack a small percentage, a believable percentage of votes, but enough to tip it over the edge, and then most states are not going to look at the paper, so you'll get off scot-free. So, just a few words about defense. There's an emerging consensus, both among a strong consensus among security experts and an emerging consensus among the election community as well, that paper ballots plus robust post-election audits form a strong, pragmatic, low-cost, and necessary defense. And I say plus because these things can't be separated. You need to have records that the voter can see, and you need to have people look at those records. So how much progress are we making towards getting this? Well, we have made a lot of national progress on implementing paper records. And in fact, there are only about a dozen states today that have any ballots left that aren't recorded on a piece of paper. Although some of these, I'll note, are important swing states. When you look at auditing, making use of that paper, the map looks a lot less good. There are only 3 states right now that require robust audits after every election, and about a dozen more, maybe a little bit more than a dozen more, that will sometimes achieve audits that give you high statistical confidence in the result. If we look at the map of swing states or likely swing states, this is using some arbitrary definition. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of places that need to improve things before the 2018 and 2020 elections. But thankfully, Congress has had some preliminary action. There was $380 million in the omnibus appropriation bill for states to start taking immediate emergency measures to safeguard their elections. This didn't come with a lot of guidance, at least a lot of limitation on how the money can be used. That has pros and cons. But it will help states start to take action right away. Also, the Secure Elections Act that Trey mentioned now has 4 Republican and 4 Democratic co-sponsors. This is an excellent piece of legislation that would provide states with guidance and resources that they need in order to effectuate paper and auditing. So there is no proof, and I want to emphasize this, that any past U.S. election has had the results hacked. But the question is, what about next time? States urgently need to improve their election infrastructure, to make attacks more difficult, to implement paper, and especially to implement post-election audits that can detect changes to the outcome with high confidence. Although some states are beginning to make progress, we need to raise the floor and ensure that all states, that no state will be a weak link in the 2020 election and beyond. And it's possible to achieve all of this if we start soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Our next speaker I would not lend my iPad to, not because he's not a good guy, but when I introduce him, you'll understand why. So Hari Hearst is a computer scientist, and at DECon, which is the largest annual hacker convention in the world, which takes place in Las Vegas every year, and last year he organized the Voting Village, where a whole bunch of voting systems were brought in, turned over to hackers, and they easily got into all of them. Many of you probably saw the publicity about this last year. So Hari's going to come up and talk about that experience, and he's also going to talk, Alex talked about audits and the importance of paper ballots and audits. And Hari, I'd like to ask you to make sure that to address some of there's some talk of electronic-based auditing, and can you actually do that? And I see you've got some props and some toys, so I think that'll be a fun presentation. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Hari Hearst.
Thank you. So when we organized the DECon election machine, voting machine hacking village, we first of all acquired the equipment mainly from eBay. So anyone in the world can buy those machines and in a convenience of their own lab or home or garage, explore how they work. Interestingly enough, a lot of claims were made saying that those are random stolen machines sold in eBay. So we physically went to one of the computer recycling companies, which have 1,300 voting machines in the storage, and they were selling them off. So I bought mine with cash. I got a receipt, but I also asked them very politely, would you ship them internationally? I said, why not? Of course. So they had no whatsoever restrictions there. So every single machine we had in the village had been previously part of the studies Alex mentioned. Every single machine we knew was hackable. There was nothing that we were not proving that they're hackable. We already knew that. What we wanted to do is to enable people to explore and see by themselves. One thing what really made me feel good was how many election officials, election supervisors came to the village to hack the machine they used to run their elections in their jurisdiction. This was the first time when they had the capability of actually seeing and exploring and finding the truth about the machines they are using. And again, a lot of the election supervisors are technologically savvy, and they were capable of hacking their own machine, and they were shocked. So that was last year. This year we are back, and I, by the way, welcome everybody who are in Las Vegas that time to come to see yourself. We have a 2,500 square feet hacking space. We have a speaker track where experts are going to tell different best practices, security, tell also a follow-up from last year. For example, from one voting machine, which we had in a village, later a forensic study was carried out. And from that particular machine, and every machine of that brand and type, they had a playlist for the media player of Chinese songs. So I think that raises some supply chain questions, but it's just me. So again, come to see yourself what it is. This year we are going to have voting machines which have never been part of independent study. So this is going to be completely, we don't know how they are going to be hacked. Let's see how long it takes. Last year, when we opened the doors at 10 and the introductory speech was happening 11, even before that, the first guy came along, hey, I hacked that machine. It literally took like 20 minutes. But he didn't demonstrate because he wanted to go to hear a speech. So he came back like an hour and a half later and then showed how it's done. So just to tell, I personally, I was shocked by the speed. Personally, I was surprised how many new ways of hacking the machines were invented. Because also people who came, they didn't have tools. They didn't know how to prepare. This year it's going to be different if people know how to prepare. They came without tools. The Twitter feed was, we need this obsolete technology in order to do it. So people were building the tools while they were doing it. So it literally was building a helicopter while flying it. Now, when we have a conversation about state actors and nation-state attackers, it actually brings the mind to unlimited resources and thinking of that kind of adversary. First of all, I have been hacking the machines since 2005, and when I started, the threat model was completely wrong. The threat model those days was the only threat is a domestic actor who is a dishonest candidate trying to win. Now we understand nation-state attackers. And nation-state attackers have completely different motivations. Maybe they don't care who wins. They just want to undermine the confidence. They want to cause chaos and discredit democracy. So when you have new threat actors, you have completely new threat models and you have new attacks. Last but not least, these tools. So whether you are a nation-state attacker or a private hacker, you probably are going to be using very similar tools. All of these tools cost less than $100. All of these are sold in the United States, and actually these all are US-made designs. Anyone with credit card can order it overnight. FedEx comes to your home. This I really love. That's $49. This tells how everything is accessible. The tools are accessible to everyone. The training, how to use these tools, available on YouTube. There is no barrier of entry into that area. And this one card, this is a small attack computer. I did this for one demonstration. This is actually pre-programmed to hack one machine. And the voter in that type has an access to USB port in a convenience of the privacy booth. Plug this in, 15 seconds, done. You have no requirement of skills other than you have to be able to plug this in. So again, barrier of entry very low, and we are constantly underestimating what is available, and we are constantly thinking the barriers to be higher than they are. And that's why most important thing is audit the results, not the machines. Thank you.
Thanks, Hari. Our next speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaeffer. He's a former national security intelligence official. Some of you may recognize him. He's on Fox News as a commentator every once in a while. And he's the vice president of the London Center for Policy Research. Tony, Hari talked about nation states and how it's changed our threat paradigm. Talk a little bit about that. Why, what kind of resources they have, why they might do that. I think they'd appreciate hearing that. Tony. Yes, you can pause.
Yeah, don't clap. It's okay.
Got his fans in the front. That's good.
I also I advised Trump 2020 as one of their national security advisors, and my Bond moment is actually in the Spy Museum. So I am literally the guy that your mother used to tell you to stay away from when you were growing up. So, to the point, I used to run a team of Harrys. During the early days, this is my retirement. In 2011 is in the Congressional record. I ran something called Stratus Ivy, and talking about nation-state and nation-state resources, we were manned to do global operations like Hari talked about. And anytime he talks about technology, I look at opportunity. All of these things, all of these moving pieces for someone like me whose job is to penetrate and to try to figure things out is hugely a gold mine for us. We have to look at anything that's moving, any 0 and 1 moving from point A to point B has a potential of being disrupted, denied, or manipulated in some form. That's an opportunity for us. And so when you look at what the technology is available, and by the way, I was in briefing Steve Cambeau, and you may remember him, he was the Director of Intelligence over the Pentagon back in the early 90s. He asked me how much money I needed for an operation. And I said $10,000. And he just looked at me like, how can that be? It's like, that's mostly travel. The technology itself is going to cost like 100, 150. So this is not difficult. This is not hard. People like Hari are always out there, and then I try to focus them on things going up. Nation states have specific objectives to do certain things. Within the context of that, they will look at, as Alex talked about, certain points of vulnerability, what we call centers of gravity. Those things, if properly identified early on, and you can get inside the supply chain, or you can understand how a system works, you can get inside of, I consider the phishing thing, the email, a human operation. That's essentially understanding how a human behavior will do something, essentially asymmetric warfare. These are all valid things that we have to accept as part of the landscape today. And it's not just the Russians. I think everybody recognizes, as pointed out, the Russians did a lot of attempts to get into the election regarding technology. There's no doubt about that. But they're not the only ones. The Iranians, North Koreans, until we do something about them, the Chinese. These are all nations which have an interest in disrupting our activities. Now, let me tell you, I can't go into a lot of the stuff we did. I'm very happy about the fact that most of the operations I ran during the period from the mid-'90s up through the mid-2000s are still uncompromised. With that said, there are certain things we did during exercises which we proved the point. So one of the stories I like to tell was about an exercise we did where I think it was Moonlight Maze. As a matter of fact, this is in the Spy Museum. You can go over and look at the thing about it. This exercise was to penetrate DoD control systems by our own hackers. One of the hacks we did was to get into the blood supply. Now, how do you compromise a blood supply, for goodness sake? It's all over the world. It's constantly being refreshed. How do you go about trying to disrupt it and make it unusual? By controlling the access to the data that manages the system. In one penetration, we were able to get in and completely destroy confidence in the system that managed the blood. So if you have the blood, but you can't get to it, you don't have the blood. That's what we're talking about here. People who can understand those critical aspects of certain vulnerabilities where, to take out a global capability, you simply had to know a specific node, how to get in to modify the information to make it so that it's scrambled or denied. And you're done. It's gone. So that's what we're talking about here. That's what we cannot permit here. So that's why Jim Woolsey and I did an editorial in May of last year for on Fox News Opinion, where we talk about the need to make sure that every voting system has a paper trail that we can audit. The auditing becomes so much more critical than ever before because of the very existence of Haris, of people like me who then harness and target their capability. And these things are done for purposes of disrupting the confidence in our democracy and the way we actually do businesses going forward. So I'll end by saying that whenever we as an American people look at this, we have to look at it as an issue both sides needs to get along. And believe it or not, I actually work with Tulsi Gabbard on some of these issues. Tulsi has been very much at the forefront of trying to find ways to make sure this upcoming election secure. There's other legislation out there right now that I think everybody needs to get behind. And for your members to understand, come bring people like us to talk to them if there's doubt. There should be no doubt at this point. We all recognize there's a number of ways that we can lose confidence and the ability to control our own future in a few key states. It is time now for us to essentially find a way to adapt best practices. As Alex said, there's a lot of states which have not really stepped up to go to the level necessary. And I'm a big 10th Amendment guy. I don't believe we should be dictating to the states. I think we should be finding a way to fund the best practices for them to all sign up to do it. But at the same time, we have to recognize that each state has its own responsibility, and that's something they must do. So in the future, I hope you all will support your member in getting behind this and doing a good job in helping us.
Thanks, Tony. So we're now going to pivot a little bit from the problem, or defining the problem, fleshing out the problem, and also to solutions on the ground. Liz Howard, who's our next speaker, Liz in 2017 was the Deputy Commissioner of Elections for the Commonwealth of Virginia. She was, meaning she helped to run the elections, and she saw what happened at DEFCON and the hacking village there. Probably freaked her out, because I remember when I was Secretary of State, when these first reports of hacking about 10, 12 years ago first came out, hearing computer scientists on a conference call, I hung up, called my state election directors, like, oh my God, I think it was a little more colorful than that. What are we going to do? So Liz had that experience, and what do you do when you're in charge of an election? And they made a really gutsy but wise decision in 2017. And now Liz is counsel at the Brennan Center, where she's continuing to work on cybersecurity. So please join me in welcoming Liz.
Thank you, Trey. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's a pleasure to share the table with Hari. And I told him earlier I probably wouldn't have been able to make that statement truthfully just a year ago, and I'll tell you why. So a year ago today, we were similarly situated. We were about 120 days out from a general election in Virginia. We were about 20 days out from DEFCON. We thought that things were pretty good. We had a great CIO. We were working to make improvements to our cybersecurity infrastructure and our cybersecurity culture. All but about 30 of our localities had transitioned over to paper-based voting systems. Our state legislature had just passed mandatory post-election audits. We thought things were okay. And then DEFCON happened. We immediately started reading articles that talked about the facts that Hari discussed earlier, how quickly our machines that were in use in Virginia were hacked. And also, and most importantly for me, one of the articles included a tweet that had the password for one of our voting machines that was in use. We knew immediately that we had a big problem and that we needed to put these machines through independent security testing. But we faced a problem, and like Alex mentioned earlier, every state does it a little bit differently. In Virginia, similar to a lot of other states, the state is solely responsible for creating a menu of certified equipment from which the localities can pick from when they decide which type of voting equipment that they want to use. That meant that the state didn't actually own any of the voting equipment. We also knew that the voting equipment vendors weren't subject to any law that required them to provide us with a sample to conduct this independent security testing on. And we believed accurately, it turned out, that they wouldn't voluntarily provide us that those sample pieces of equipment. So I literally drove around the state and picked up voting equipment in my sedan, all but in the middle of the night, from friendly election officials who also had concerns about the security of their election equipment, but had concerns about speaking about that publicly because they didn't have the support from their locals who controlled the purse strings to get new equipment. I was unable to get one of the pieces of equipment that were on Alex's slide earlier. I was unable to get a piece of a Hart E-Slate. So we reluctantly called Hart and said, can you please provide us with a piece of equipment for security testing? Hart told our chief election official, no, you may not have a piece of our equipment for testing. This was a big problem for us. This was, at that point, about 80 days prior to the November general election. We were working with our IT agency, in Virginia we called it VITA, to conduct this independent testing. And of course, VITA wanted a lot more time than we could give them because the election was coming up. And we talked to them about some of their initial results, which were scary. And we said, VITA, we at the Department of Elections, we have lost confidence in the election results generated by these machines. And we are looking at, in Virginia, what we expect to have multiple close elections in November. People, we have to assume at this juncture, are going to question the election results after Election Day. And VITA, we are unwilling to get up to the microphone after Election Day and to tell the public that we have faith in these election machines. We said, VITA, we are going to pass the microphone to you. Are you willing to publicly state that you have faith in the election results from these paperless DREs after Election Day when people are raising legitimate concerns? That's what we heard on the other end of the line from Vida. So needless to say, 59 days prior to the election, we decertified all of the paperless DREs in Virginia. While I am not always on the same team as the voting equipment vendors in this area, they were exceptional team players. They made sure that all of the affected localities had the equipment that they needed and the training that they needed. I think also important here is to note that by the time we officially decertified the equipment, there were only about 20 localities that were still using DREs. And many of the election officials had reached out to us and said, Liz, please decertify the equipment, because if you don't, our local government officials will never give us the money to make the change. And they said that they would still be using the paperless DREs today. So I think that the situation that we faced in Virginia last year is very similar to the situation that we face today. We know that there are going to be close elections coming up in 2018 and 2020. We know that the elections are going to try to interfere, the Russians are going to try to interfere with our elections. And we know that one of their main priorities is simply to cause an erosion in the voters' confidence in the integrity of our democracy. And we have some simple, low-tech solutions that we can implement quickly and effectively. And those are encompassed in the SEA. And I hope you work with your member to support it, and let us know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Liz. So Liz showed that you can switch to paper and you can run an election, maybe not an ideal time frame. Longer run would be better, but you can do it. Another important component of the solution you've heard talked about is audits. Our next speaker, Chantil Soter, is with Cuyahoga County, which is the county that contains Cleveland, Ohio. She is the election and compliance administrator, and Cuyahoga County has been doing a type of audit called a risk limiting audit for a while now. And we'd like to ask Chantil to come talk about RLAs, as we call it in the trade, how they work. Are they that hard? We hear a lot about how hard and how expensive they might be. Are they effective? And why'd you all make the switch? So please join me in welcoming Chantil.
Good afternoon. So in Cleveland, Ohio, in our Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, we've actually been doing risk limiting audits since about 2011. And we originally started doing risk limiting audits in our county due to an EAC grant that was offered that allowed us to research best practices for election administrators. And we found it very important to include risk limiting audit in that grant funds, due to the fact that we had been unfortunately not under the best media coming up to the elections in 2004 and 2005. We were under a lot of scrutiny, and we found it we
It's a vote. Yeah. It's just because the door's open to crack. That's just coincidental.
sorry. In 2004 and 2005, we did have some negative media, and a lot of people have talked up here on the panel today about the importance of voter confidence in your elections. And as an election administrator, I think one of the things that's hardest to hear is from registered voters within your county that they don't have confidence in the results that you're producing as an election official. And, we don't claim to be mathematicians or experts in any of these fields, but however, we do really, truly, genuinely care about making sure that the results are accurate and transparent. So one of the things that we found is that once we brought the public in and started introducing the whole concept of risk limiting audit and implementing those in Cuyahoga County, we actually started to see an increased confidence from the voters. And right now in the state of Ohio, there are Secretary of State directives that require us to do post-election audits after certain elections, so in even years and after presidential primary elections. But we actually in Cuyahoga do voluntary audits after every election. We do those under the risk limiting form. And there has been a lot of conversations and discussions about whether or not local election jurisdictions have the ability to pull off something like risk-limiting audits after every election. And in Cuyahoga County, we have found that risk-limiting audits are actually much more efficient than a normal tiered audit. And one of the most important parts of that is having the actual paper of the ballots there present with you. So we don't even include any of the election equipment when we're doing the audit after the election. And we have actually reduced the number of sheets of paper and ballots that we touch from the onset of risk-limiting audits in 2011 by 250,000 sheets of paper. So imagine local election officials hand counting ballots, and due to the statistical confidence of a risk-limiting audit, we've been able to reduce the number of sheets of paper that we do touch. In conclusion, I would say that there are finally a lot of conversations starting to happen about post-election audits in general and risk-limiting audits, and we do offer in Cuyahoga County a lot of tools for local election jurisdictions to use that allow them to simply drop in the results of their election regardless of the equipment that's being used. So there are tools out there. There are several professors and mathematicians in the academic world that are more than willing to help and assist local election officials in getting this job done.
Our final panelist is Dan Savickas, excuse me, who's the Legislative Outreach Manager at Frieda Marx. I'm a Republican, and one of the concerns I often hear from my Republican colleagues when it comes to federal election legislation is 10th Amendment issues. Shouldn't we leave elections up to the state? We don't need to micromanage. It's one size fits all. There's a lot of federalism concerns. Frieda Marx supports the Secure Elections Act, and so I'd like to have Dan come up and talk a little bit about that. If anybody's concerned about federal overreach, it's these guys. And just curious, your support of why is this important? And when you talk to your members and you hear from your members, why do they support it and why should others? Yes. Dan.
So Frieda Marx is big into protecting individual liberties, the free market, and the Constitution. It doesn't seem like a bold platform, but sometimes you'd be surprised in this town. And securing the integrity of voting rights is a very important part of preserving the integrity of the Constitution itself. And as Trey mentioned, as I think the Lieutenant Colonel alluded to earlier, under the 10th Amendment, states are tasked with election governance. Absolutely. But the federal government is charged by the Constitution with providing for the general welfare and the common defense. And any right-of-center people in this room would take pause when I say that, because a lot of national security types and politicians in Washington take the general welfare and common defense clause and say, oh, general welfare and common defense is basically everything, so the federal government can do whatever it wants. Not the case. But the General Welfare and Common Defense Clause is derived from Article 8 of the Articles of Confederation when they wrote it at the Constitutional Convention. And Article 8 says all charges of war and others incurred for the common defense shall be defrayed by the National Treasury authorized by the United States Congress. And that National Treasury was provided for with funds from the states. So an accountability measure that implements cost sharing between the federal government and state governments to provide for the common defense by ensuring the integrity of our elections is something that actually fits the description of what the founders intended when they talk about general welfare and common defense, and isn't one of these broad interpretations of federal power under the Constitution. And if you're still not convinced by all of that, just think about if this problem gets farther out of hand, the NSA or the deep state, if you're so inclined, will find a more authoritarian solution to secure elections and provide for national security. Now, again, this is not an anti-technology or an anti-innovation measure that is preventing local authorities from making elections more efficient just because Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran, or whoever the bogeyman of the month is allowed to live rent-free inside of our heads. This is mostly ensuring that elections have accountability and are auditable to ensure that the results are accurate and that we can verify the winners and losers of the election. And now, as a number of my other panelists have mentioned, this is not something that's mainly coming from the right wing. Lieutenant Colonel mentioned he's been working with Tulsi Gabbard on issues like this, and in the House there's a bill very similar called the Paper Act, sponsored by Rep. Mark Meadows, Rep. Ralph Norman from California, Dem Rep. Ro Kahana, and the at-large D.C. delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton. These are not your garden variety centrist squishes, nor are they like-minded people. This has broad bipartisan support from the deepest corners of each side of the ideological spectrum, and this is something that both sides have been able to come together on to strengthen our republic, ensure that our elections have integrity, and so that we don't have to bog down our government with questions about whether a presidential election is actually fair and accurate and wasn't infiltrated by a foreign power, and then we can get back to getting at each other's throats over the normal issues. So this is not something that is in violation of the Constitution, and in fact will strengthen our republic and strengthen our Constitution. Thank you.
So in our remaining time, we're going to do some questions. And before opening up to all of you, so start thinking about your best great question. I want to ask the panel 2 questions. I'll just kind of throw this out. Please don't all answer it, but you don't. So the first one is, I'm going to ask maybe Liz. Why don't you just we've heard some references to the Secure Election Act. Why don't you just describe it a little bit, because it's the piece of legislation that has currently the most co-sponsors and bipartisan, and just kind of for the folks in the audience, especially folks who are working in the Senate, whose bosses may not be as familiar with it. Could you just give a quick overview of the SEA, or the Secure Elections Act?
So, thank you, Trey. It's got 3 main pieces. So one of which is going to require, which I think is so important, require mandatory reporting of cyber incidents. One of the issues that we faced in Virginia was just the complete dearth of knowledge. We didn't know whether or not any of our vendors had been attacked. We didn't know whether any of our localities had been attacked. And none of them were required to tell us. And so the reporting requirements in the SEA, I think, are exceptionally important. The other 2 other pieces, right, are going to require the transition over to paper-based voting systems, which again is very important because it creates a tangible, auditable paper trail, and that goes into the audit requirement. So you will be required to actually not only have the paper that you can conduct an audit on, but you would be required to actually audit that paper. And as you know, right, this is a very important piece because not only will it also has a deterrent effect for people that are interested in interfering with our elections.
Alex or Hari, why don't one of you take a stab at this one? We've talked a lot about audits, and we've talked a lot risk limiting audits and paper audits. Some argue that a form of audit that's acceptable will be an electronic image audit, not just a piece of paper. I know you don't agree with that. So could you talk about, first of all, describe what that is, and then talk about why you think that might be, or why that doesn't solve the problem that we're trying to address?
Sure. So in a typical post-election audit, what's called a risk-limiting audit, you pick a random sample of the ballots and have poll workers go and pull those ballots manually and record what they say. It's basically a way to tabulate the election and see what the result is without relying on the computer systems. There is an alternative method that involves having the voting machines that scan the ballots the first time make basically a digital photograph of each ballot as it's going through the machine. And then you show people these digital photographs and ask them to interpret the ballots. Now, does anyone see what the problem might be with that? Well, the problem is that it's not actually that hard for malicious software that might infect the voting machines or for someone who hacked into the auditing system to go and doctor those photographs of the ballots so that they show a different result than the real one. And for that reason, there's just no substitute to an audit that's actually based on people and physical ballots. I think even President Trump has said that that there's something really great about voting with pieces of paper. You don't have to worry about hacking, and he's right.
In DEFCON, Margaret McAlpine is going to have a presentation about non-malicious things happening in scanning, meaning, for example, a software might have a punch hole removal as a feature. Well, voted oval looks a lot like punch hole, so it removes it. So if you are doing digital image, you have to establish trust that the images are accurate and the images are a true representation of the ballot population. And that is a step which you need to do.
And the images are, they're backups essentially, and that's ideally the only way you would actually, if the paper went away, if there was a fire or something, they were stolen, that's probably the only value they have? Is that?
Well, it's valuable for detecting, say, errors in the scanning mechanism, but it's not valuable for defending against a malicious attacker who's trying to subvert your system and making it behave the wrong way, because, well, they can get around it. We worry a lot about insecurity, about attackers who understand our defenses and try to make systems that subvert them. Like, think about the Volkswagen emissions scandal, right, where software was programmed to detect it was being tested and not cheat when it was being tested, but cheat during normal driving. Well, we worry about the same thing in elections, that a lot of these mechanisms that are good at detecting errors when you don't have a specific attacker trying to subvert you, they don't work when you're in a malicious threat model.
Dan, you mentioned the PAPER Act. I think it's a pretty simple bill, but just to be clear, could you just describe what the PAPER Act requires that Representative Meadows has introduced in the House?
Sure. As far as I'm concerned, it just ensures that states have a paper record to ensure that elections can be audited. It does not direct states on how to run their elections, where to run their elections. It's not that. That's why I addressed the 10th Amendment concerns. It's not dictating how states run their elections. It just makes sure that you have a paper record to ensure that there's an audit available after the fact.
Yeah, and so you're going to do this. You're going to be a perfect role model for me. So here's what you're going to do. So tell me your name, where you work, what your affiliation is. Because we're live streaming this, I'll repeat your question. I might paraphrase it, and if I mess up with my paraphrase, tell me. But that way, folks in the back or folks viewing this can hear it. So, ready to be our first great questioner? Awesome, thanks.
My name's Corey Crew. I'm a fellow with House Oversight, and my question was just to follow up on what you had just mentioned. So, in regards to the PAPER Act, stipulation is essentially that that traceable paper audits are required. Is that requirement at all tied to how HAVA funds are distributed? So if the state is not in compliance, with having auditable paper ballots, are there essentially any consequences? Is it possible that they could not receive HAVA funds, or outside of that, is there anything else to essentially incentivize states to comply?
So Corey Crew is a fellow with House Oversight, had a question about compliance with HAVA. Are there incentives in the bill for the states to comply with the paper? Is that a pretty good, quick paraphrase? Yes. Okay, thanks, Corey.
To the best of my knowledge, although I haven't looked at this bill too recently, I do think that there are incentives. Obviously, it varies state by state. A state like California, which has about 1 million different ballot options and large counties who run elections, paper ballots wouldn't be the most practical thing for them to do. So I believe there are incentives to get states like California with different election systems working within the system, recognizing that each state has different needs. I do believe provisions like that are included in the bill.
Alex wants to chime in here for a second.
So the PAPER Act would create a new pool of grant money that states could draw on if they if they were able to meet certain guidelines that would be established by a panel of experts and election officials. That those guidelines would include guidelines for paper and guidelines for auditing. So that's one way you could raise the floor. Another way, another approach you could imagine would be to set some minimum standards that are not overly prescriptive, but that states can find their own ways of meeting, such as a requirement that you perform a post-election audit that results in high statistical confidence by one means or another in the election outcome without reliance on the computers.
Next question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Karina Ramirez Velasquez, and I'm an intern here at the U.S. Congress. Sorry, my name is Karina Ramirez Velasquez, and I'm an intern here with Senator Merkley. My question is, I'm hearing a lot about, protecting like these machines and making sure that there's like security in our like voting system. However, I'm wondering about like bots and trolls that are created like in Eastern Europe and in Asia to kind of influence the results of the election, maybe not necessarily like hacking into the machines, but creating like news articles to persuade voters to vote a different way. Do you think what will that look like for our state department to, if we're talking about the integrity of election, how are we protecting voters to not be influenced by facts that may not be true, or if they want like a political party to like rise up, does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, and I think Tony's ready to chime in. Thanks, Karina.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we call it information operations. The Russians, the Chinese, we all engage in deception and counter-deception operations. So there's not one single solution. All sides, every nation state has the ability to essentially project information. That information can be completely made up, can be partly true. The best propaganda always has an element of truth in it. The Russians are masters of this, and don't let anybody fool you. The Russians did everything they could to screw with the elections. I don't think they really cared all much who won. I think it was just all about undermining the confidence in our system overall. So the best way to fight that is essentially two ways. First, the Department of Defense, CIA, NSA, all the different intelligence agencies have worked very hard to try to understand the thinking of the adversary. One of the best things we can do, and this was well documented, the Obama administration had a pretty good heads up that the Russians were up to no good, and they didn't warn people. That to me is a failure of policy. And a lot of you've probably seen me talk about this on TV. My belief is the biggest intelligence failures weren't intelligence failures, they were failures of policy. The policy was to deny the factual information coming in. In this case, President Obama's own national security guy said, I was told not to retaliate. That's bad. Secondly, to that point, you've got to push back. If you don't do something to actually push back on these countries to say this is not acceptable, and again, I'll be a little bit probably provocative here. President Obama telling Putin to knock it off, that's not really it. You've got to back that up with other things we can do to make that point. Some things directly, some things indirectly. We have the most expensive intelligence community on the planet. For goodness sake, if you're going to have it, do something with it. And that doesn't have to be publicly acknowledged what you do. I'm just saying that during the Cold War, a lot of my friends and mentors are from the Reagan years, Bud McFarlane. There was a lot of things that we were doing to the Russians we never acknowledged, nor would we. But the Russians knew it. So the idea here is to go back at them. And third, and most importantly, be a buyer beware. You've always got to look at the source. And I'm not for Facebook or Twitter editing out what they believe to be fake. To me, that's too much like Big Brother. That's way too much like, oh, we're going to tell you what to think, because that, even if you're trying to do it for good purposes, you're not always going to have good people in charge of that technology. It can be abused. So this is where I think an open society's best judge of the truth is by having every citizen diligent to the source and checking it out. I think the truth will always out. So I'm not sure if that's the best answer, but it's the best correct answer I know. There's just no one way we can combat that other than by having our system be aware of it and doing everything it can from the president on down to try to get information out on that.
Thanks. One thing you may, if you're interested in this, a couple weeks ago, the Senate Intelligence Committee had a hearing, and they were on the information. What was the phrase you used to describe the information operations? The information operations side. So it was two of the folks who were in the Obama administration talked about what they experienced in those kinds of conversations, and you can stream it. It's a pretty interesting conversation. Yes. Thanks. Yes, you're in the second row on the aisle. Oh, I'm sorry. We got a microphone in the back who's controlling. Can he be next? Awesome. All right. Thanks.
So I appreciate you all breaking down.
Name and ID? Not
okay.
ID, sorry, that sounds.
Yeah.
We're not talking about stuff we don't agree.
Privacy
Name and
security,
affiliation.
Yeah. Assad, I'm with Senator Schatz's office.
Perfect.
So I appreciate you all breaking down the different angles at this topic. And the line of logic makes sense to me that because this is an area, elections are an area that are vulnerable to nation states, we need paper trail and audits. That all makes sense to me. But this is not the only topic that nation state that is vulnerable to nation states. Our financial markets, we don't maintain paper trails in the same way when we do a bunch of trading. Utilities are vulnerable in the same way. So why aren't those solutions emerging in those areas?
That's a great question. Yeah, well, several of you might want to chime in. Mr. Alex, and then maybe Tony.
Well,
or Tony then.
let me just start by saying this is a huge issue. I actually worked with the Federal Reserve to advise them on the very issue you're talking about. And one of the things that's been notable is that a lot of big corporations never report the hacks because of fiduciary responsibilities, which is a huge issue. So a lot of these companies had no incentive to report. As a matter of fact, it was cheaper to not report it and pretend it never happened and maintain the vulnerability in doing that back. Plus, there's the issue of what do you do if you're hacked? There's been a discouragement by the federal government to allow companies to basically do offensive operations back at adversaries. So these are issues which are, in my judgment, not really clearly identified yet, but what you're saying is a very big issue. So
the reason that that elections are different than the financial system is the problem has a different shape. They're different requirements. So in the financial system generally, when we're moving money around, we're able to give people receipts. We're able to keep double ledger account books. We're able to track where that money is, not in a centralized way, but in various decentralized ways, in order to be able to cross-check things, in order to a great degree be able to reverse things. Voting is different. In voting, we need to both have that same kind of high integrity, but also ensure the secret ballot, because ballot secrecy is what protects everyone from other people selling their votes, other people being coerced into doing certain things. We need the secret ballot in order to protect the election, but the secret ballot means we can't use those same shapes of mechanisms to protect votes. It turns out, though, that there are some really convenient mechanisms if you involve physical tokens like pieces of paper for providing both integrity and protecting ballot secrecy. But if you adopt paper, then voting turns out to be one of the perhaps most solvable great cybersecurity challenges. It's much easier to secure the voting system than to secure the banking system or the power grid or those other pieces of infrastructure because the low-tech solution can work.
I would also like to point out one thing. When right after the election, the statements came out, we weren't hacked. Earlier this year, FBI published an average time from breach to detection of breach, and I believe that's 304 days. That is how long it takes on average from breach to find out that you have been breached.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Adam Eisgrow. I'm the policy director for the world's biggest and longest established association of computing professionals, which is proud to claim Alex, among others, as a member. Alex, sorry to pick on you, sir.
What's the name of the group?
Sorry, the Association for Computing Machinery, which will now fire me for not mentioning it. So I'm the soon-to-be former director. Alex happily is from Michigan, where I understand there is a civilian cyber corps, MIC3, of cybersecurity experts that is working through the state government to provide expertise hopefully not necessarily after an attack, but maybe during and before. Alex, if you're familiar with that, could you comment on its utility? And my not so hidden motive for asking is we are a channel to those 50,000 US-based experts all over the country, and perhaps Liz or others might want to address where replicating that model, if it's working, might be most effective, and then I'll consider that homework.
Perfect. Alex?
Let me just say ACM is a great organization and is among the good resources in this area.
So I'm sorry, could you restate your question to me?
If we know or if you know on the panel, is that model in Michigan working? Those sort of a private collection through government sponsorship of cyber experts being available to lend their expertise to election officials upon request, I presume. And then if that is a replicable and should be a replicable model, where is it most needed in the United States?
And Liz, if you don't know the specifics, maybe just ask in the general sense, would that be valuable, and how, putting on your old election official hat, how that might
Thank you, yes.
work?
So I can talk about this. We don't have that in Virginia, but I do believe that it would be valuable. So for instance, when VITA, our IT agency, had to conduct testing on the various different makes and models of the voting equipment that VITA had no familiarity with, they had to consult with outside experts to come up with the testing protocols. So they specifically contacted Verified Voting, which Alex is also involved in. So absolutely having a network that we as election officials and or our IT agencies can call on would be a big help.
But I should say that there are something like 18,000 election jurisdictions in this country, and there are nothing like 18,000 election cybersecurity experts in this country. There's an incredible asymmetry here. And the bad guys just have to can test everything and find the weakest spots. This is why we need to raise the floor. We need to do things that are going to give states resources, give them guidance in order to get all of our security up to a level that can withstand these threats.
All right.
I would like to point out one thing. We are talking right now a lot about election systems, and the image in your head is the election software. That's not sufficient to audit that. Actually, my first hacks were all outside of the election software, but enabled changing the outcome of the election. You have to audit everything, the whole supply chain, all hardware, all firmware, everything, because the vulnerability you are looking might not be even in the election software. It might be in a basement. It might be in a firmware. So it's an extremely complex area when you try to secure an election system because of all the third-party elements.
Well, can I just add to that you're talking about an alternative in which we want to be able to trust the computers without verifying them. In order to trust the computer hardware and software without externally, physically verifying the results through an audit, you have to worry about so many different layers and factors and supply chain factors. That's why the physical audit of the paper after the election is the emerging consensus alternative. This is the way that we can get to a very high level of confidence without having to go through auditing 10 million lines of source code and eliminating all errors, is something that has almost never been done successfully in any system. And just let me clarify for people who may not know what a risk limiting audit is. A risk limiting audit, this is the most sophisticated form of post-election auditing today that some states are beginning to practice. That means that you want to set in advance how confident you want to be that the worst case attack would be detected. Say you want no more than a 5% chance that the outcome could be wrong in the worst case. You decide that in advance, and then you go and look at enough evidence, depending on the election results, to get to that level of confidence. It's sort of like taking an exit poll. You go and look at ballots, see what they are, and the number of ballots you have to look at, well, that level of confidence depends on how close the election was. If the election is a landslide, a very small number of ballots from across the state, maybe a few hundred, would be enough to confirm that it's a landslide. If the election is a tie, you need to do, you would in any case need to do a full manual count to confirm that it was a tie. But a risk limiting audit very smoothly and efficiently goes in between a landslide and a tie, increasing the sample size that you do, so that in all cases you just do the minimal amount of work you need to get to that preset level of confidence.
Alex, before we were starting today, you and I were in a conversation. We were talking about the opposite of a landslide, which would have been the Alabama U.S. Senate special election most recently, which was a 20,000 vote margin of victory. How many ballots did you say an RLA, the spreadsheet would recommend, or maybe Susan, do you remember the number? So, yeah, so 550 ballots in a statewide election with a 20,000 vote margin, which is a fairly close, it's not a nail biter, but it's not a blowout. So that's not a lot of ballots, just to kind of put this in context. I think there's a microphone here, and then, I'm sorry, we got you, and then you. And we're running close, so let's do this. You ask your question, don't answer it yet. Then you ask your question. Can you bring the microphone up? And then maybe there'll be some overlapping, and we'll get, because the senator's coming, right? Yeah. So let's try this. We're going to do rapid response, but we're going to do rapid question with rapid response.
Lindsay Daniels with the Democracy Fund. So just to follow up on the points that you were both just making on the RLAs, maybe for Chantil, about just how long does it actually take to get to the point where you can do that? Because I recognize that 550 ballots is probably not a lot, but there has to be a process in place, and I'm assuming in order to actually figure out how you do this randomized sample. And so how long did it take you to get to the point in your county for an election official who's the one who's going to have to do this to actually get to the point where you can do this effectively? And then for Hari, I was just wondering, which states are using the machines that you all hacked at the DEFCON event?
Okay, so hold those two questions. Or actually, once you answer those, hold those questions. You ask yours. Moderator's privilege. Okay, ask yours.
Hi, my name's Christine. I'm a reporter with McClatchy. I actually have a question about the states that aren't using or are actually still using the paperless DRE machines. Are there steps that they can take in the meantime, while they're trying to secure funding to update the machines? Are there steps that they can take in the meantime to secure their election results when they still have paperless voting machines?
Okay, and then last one.
My name's Charles. I'm with the House Oversight Committee. My question is, if the thesis of this panel is that elections require trust but verify, how well have the states that have recently received federal funding used that funding to shore up their vulnerabilities in time for the 2018 midterms?
Okay, perfect. So I think Chantil, we'll start with you on the RLA experience.
I think that the hardest part for an election official is coming up with a formula and determining your risk factor or what your confidence level is going to be. And we were fortunate enough to work with several mathematicians. And I think that process took us, a few weeks to first wrap our minds around exactly how complicated that formula was going to be. But once we were able to come to an agreement, and our board members were able to decide that we were comfortable with a 90% confidence level. For each election at this point, it's a matter of just dropping in your election results into an Excel spreadsheet and then formulating how many batches that you'll need to pull for the election. And then actually it will, in a risk limiting audit, if you do find a ballot that isn't the same marking as what you have it tabulated as your equipment tabulated during your official certification, it will escalate the audit to require you to touch more ballots. And so that part is also built into the spreadsheets that we have created in advance. So we recently just did an audit for the May election, and it was a large contest. It took us one day. I believe that we audited a countywide contest in I don't have the details of the margin of victory, but it's a standard size contest and what I would consider normal margin of victory. And it took us one full day. And I think that's probably a few years of practice of getting what we need organized in advance. But it's definitely not something that is overwhelming.
And then the second half of the question about the machines that were hacked at DEFCON are still in use. And that, you can probably answer that one really quickly because I think.
So the fastest way to find it out is the verified voting has a wonderful inventory of all the machines and where they are used. The machines hacked were Premier/Diebold/ whatever TSX, ESNS Ivotronic, WinVote, and Sequoia Advantage Plus ePoll book, which was a Extrapoll 5000. So by going to the verified voting website, you see where they are in use.
That Diebold machine is still used in 20 states, so 20 is the minimum number.
And just to be clear, it's not necessarily used in every precinct in all 20 states,
Right.
but in 20 states.
In parts
you
of
will
20
see,
states.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the question about how yours is a slightly different version of that question, which was. Yeah. Yeah, for the states. And so if you're predicated on if they're stuck with that machine, what can they do right now?
They can't do very much, unfortunately. They can try to raise the bar for attacks by making sure that, say, their election management systems are well firewalled, and not firewalled, are well isolated. But the fact is, for 2018, if a sophisticated nation state wants to cause chaos on Election Day, they're probably already in our systems.
And Liz would say that you actually can do something because you can decertify all of them and get new ones in place by Election Day, right?
You've got a few more days. But some of the other common sense things that you can do are just work to ensure that you've got good contingency plans in place if you are continuing to use these paperless DREs. So a couple of specific recommendations, obviously ensuring that you have, if you are continuing to use a paperless DREs, you have a sufficient supply of emergency ballots, which are slightly different than provisional ballots, and those are ballots that are issued to individuals in polling locations after you have verified that they are eligible to vote, but the voting machine, the paperless DRE, has gone down, which is very possible considering, as has been said earlier, these machines are old and sometimes have not been maintained properly. Secondly, obviously having sufficient provisional ballots, and that will protect you in the event that either your paperless DRE goes down or your electronic poll book malfunctions or has another problem on Election Day.
And there's things you should do regardless of the type of machine, locks and seals and, here's our standard operating procedure, making sure the warehouse is secure, those sorts of things. You should do that regardless, but they do minimize the ability of people to get in. The memory cards, making sure they're new, getting rid of them if they're after the election. These are all things that you should always do, but particularly in this case. It's kind of like, banks have money, robbers go to banks, what do? They have standard operating procedures and die packs, and they can't stop everything, but they minimize the risks. Hari, I think you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that physical security does have a impact in this. So it's too late right now if there is a sophisticated attack. It's already then in and that's going on, but still, when you try to do something improving physical security, chain of custody, making sure then that you know where the equipment are, who is using them, who has access to them, no sleepovers, sending the machines to homes of the poll workers for 2 weeks ahead of time, stuff like
that. That happens.
That actually is a standard procedure in a number of states.
Yeah, that happens. And then the last question from the House Oversight staff member was about the trust but verify, and also how are states getting ready, how are we getting ready for 2018 based upon the money that's been distributed and that sort of thing? Alex, you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. So really quickly, I'd say that the money for 2018 is being spent inconsistently. That there are some states that are applying good steps or where it's helped to catalyze them upgrading all of their equipment with the state shipping in money as well. But there are other states where the counties need the money, but the state isn't distributing it to them yet. I think it's regrettable that that money came without further guidance about how states should use it, and I think there's more the EAC could be doing now about helping states to understand effective ways to use that money.
I think Senator Langford's en route because I saw his staff member walk out to go meet him. So let me ask this question of maybe Chantil and Liz. One of the things I get a sense from my former election administrator colleagues is that over the last few years, the concept of paper, and certainly compared to like 10, 12 years ago when the Help America Vote Act was rolled out, But more recently, post-election audits and specifically RLAs, there's kind of a growing consensus that this is the right approach. So we're not talking about RLA's approach cutting edge a little bit, but as your experience in Cuyahoga County has shown, you all have been doing it for 6-7 years now. Is that a correct assessment of the state of where things are? You know, we obviously need more, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about the need for federal legislation or state legislation. But is there a growing consensus among your colleagues that these are things that we need to be doing? And maybe they're resource constrained. Maybe it's the local purse strings holder that are holding people back. Or maybe it's the legislator that doesn't understand the problem, the full scope of the problem. But among the administrators, this is kind of like they get it and they'd like to see this, and that's different than a few years ago.
I think that in the state of Ohio, our DREs have to have the verified paper audit trail. So there is some sort of paper backup. And I do believe that when you talk to jurisdictions that are all paper or optical scan or digital scan ballots, that we are more comfortable in saying that this, it's not as scary as it may seem at first when you think about managing 1 million sheets of paper after each election, and that you have to retain them for 22 months in a federal election, just the storage of things like that, and being able to go back to a certain precinct and find the ballot that you're looking for necessarily can be difficult. But I think the more and more that we have forms like this and, talk to each other, and even within the state, and people come to visit to see that it's not as overwhelmingly difficult to manage. I think that's probably the biggest hurdle that election jurisdictions are facing. But I do see a trend moving towards paper-based, when before it was, all touch screens was all the talk.
And you get a lot more questions about audits now.
Yes.
You're the RLA expert.
Yes, it was not very, very popular until recently.
So, Liz, I'm going to have you hold your answer, because we're really excited to have Senator Lankford here before us. He's been a real hero to those of us in the elections community for his leadership on this issue. We're glad to have you here. Come on forward.
I would legitimately shy away from the term election hero, but I appreciate that. Thanks for y'all's engagement. Thanks for contributing so much as far as the dialogue. So much of the dialogue is just the communication, and quite frankly, that's one of the best things that we can do. And a lot of our dialogue here about election security, it's how can we get faster communication to the states? How can we allow states to be able to talk to each other? And how can we do a crazy thing, allow states to talk to the federal government and the federal government hears it? That's a lot of the conversation that's happening right now. And what we discovered in 2016 was some of the breakdown in the system, was just the most basic element of some of that communication. So I appreciate this and the idea sharing on it. Election security, as everyone in this group knows, is a state issue. It needs to remain a state issue. States run elections. I don't want to see the federalization of all elections nationwide. Part of the power of our system and the pushback that we have from a foreign entity trying to attack our system is the diversity of systems that we have, because to attack the entire nation would be so incredibly complex to be able to do that there is a great benefit to the diversity of our system. But it's also a weakness of our system. That if any one single entity anywhere in the country is weak and vulnerable, then the whole election hinges on that one county, on that one township, on that one state. And so every state has to be able to step up and to be able to do their best. As we saw in the election of 2000, when we all stared at people looking at hanging chads, the entire country can wait months on the results of one election. And one of the things that I try to be able to bring to people over and over again is the Russians did this last time in 2016. It could be the North Koreans next time. It could be a domestic hacktivist group that just decides they're mad and they want to be able to create some chaos. It doesn't have to be a foreign actor. And it doesn't have to be even getting into the voting machines. So the voting machines, we need to have auditable systems. We need to be able to verify it after the fact with risk limiting audits. And we need to be able to do some of those things to give trust for everyone in the system. But the scenario that we talk about a lot is something even simpler than that. We as Americans, rightfully, are a little skeptical of each other. We love each other, but we're also skeptical of each other. And in elections, all that has to happen is for a foreign actor or an activist group to be able to hack in, not into the voting system, but to the unofficial results that the Secretary of State puts out from their state. So on election night, when everyone's going through that website, as the results are being fed into the system, if the formula has been changed internally, and they're putting in the right results, and the wrong results are coming out in the formula. On election night, every candidate thinks they lost, but they actually won. And then the next day or 2 days later, when the official results come out, everything's switched. What happens? What happens in that state? What happens in the country? No votes were actually changed, just the perception that something might have changed is out there. That breeds so much chaos and mistrust that for months or years, there'd be this sense of, did they really win? Did they really lose? And then you've got a distracted electorate and a distracted elected officials then for months or years through the process. There are vulnerabilities in our system that we should pay attention to. Some are dramatic, like actually changing votes. Some are subtle, like just trying to alter a formula in a website and making that vulnerable so that people can't trust the results that they got. All of those things matter, though. So for all of us that are engaged in this and trying to be able to work through the system to make sure that we have the best possible system that can be audited, that we have the most reliable system that's out there, we're all working for a very basic thing. One person, one vote, and the belief that that vote actually counts and was counted correctly. That's a big issue for us. So thank you again for staying engaged in this. We cannot assume that things are done, and we can't even assume that things are done now, and so everything's checked off. One of the things that we're working on in election security language and for a bill is to be able to do something very simple. What we're learning right now, codify into law, and so that 10 years from now, when everyone gets complacent, it's still in normal practice in the law. We're still going to do it from a federal side. We're still going to stay engaged. We're still going to get security clearances to state officials so we can have communication. We're still encouraging communication from state officials to the federal government to be able to share ideas. If we can set that up as a principle, when people get complacent 10 years from now, the structure is still running, and it continues to be able to protect our system in the days ahead. So thanks again. Thanks for the quick invitation to be able to help shut this whole thing down from a very long day that I understand is some very good information. So I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
So kind of to wrap things up, so tomorrow at 10:30 a.m., the Senate Rules Committee is going to have an elections conversation. Senator Langford's going to testify. One or two of his colleagues are going to testify. Some election administrators, some voting system vendors are also going to testify, as well as the Elections Assistance Committee. Commission's going to have some folks. So that'll be a continuation of this conversation. For those who work for members of the House or the Senate, or for groups that, upon hearing this, you want to get more engaged, you think you'd like to learn more, you'd like to help educate your member or your group, anybody here on stage, as well as a few other folks, we're happy to have conversations with you. We're Republicans, Democrats, Independents, from the left and from the right, and we've come together because we believe this is an important problem that we can solve, that there is a challenge and there's a solution, and it's clear what we can do to help address this challenge. And we want to help all of you join our coalition to make this happen. So thanks for coming out today. We really appreciate it. Have a great day. That was great. Thanks. Very well done. Thanks. You did a great job. Thanks, Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you. So when I worked at the Kennedy School, I was often the moderator of the forum, which is the big public speaking venue. Oh, wow. And so I'm used to like doing things on the fly and figuring stuff out. And staring at the back of the room.
It's certainly a skill to moderate these things well. You did a very, very nice job.
Well, I appreciate you guys today and everything been doing.
Oh, hey, thank you. Yeah, let me know if I can do help you guys. Actually, it was
Went well.
Yeah, it's very good. Senator Langford is fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I was needed some more filled in the Greek word.
Well, I'm happy to help. Healthy average, too. Healthy actually.
So I